Three, two, one, here we go. Rainman's Take podcast. Observations on the world we live in. My take on current events and other topics of interest. Also, interviews with some really cool people. So let's get the conversation going. Hey, everybody, it's the Rain Man. Just want to give a quick shout out to everybody watching. Thank you very much. I know you're going to find this next interview thought-provoking. I enjoy spending time with people like my next guest and getting into more detail about the subject matter, and I know you appreciate that as well. So go ahead and hit the like button and subscribe. That way we can continue bringing you great content in the future. So thanks again for being part of Rain Man's Take, and enjoy the interview. Hey, everybody, it's the Rain Man. I want to welcome back my guest, CC King. CC, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Good, good. Thanks for joining me. So some of you will remember I had CC on a while back. He runs the Diabetes Research Connection, which is a really interesting research facility focusing on diabetes and how they fund it. It was just a really fascinating interview. And I wanted to have CC back on because several months ago we were together and the Olympics were on. And somehow we got on the subject of that Russian figure skater who got busted for some type of performing enhancing drugs in her system. And at the time, CC, you had mentioned that in your past kind of career in research and in science, you had actually worked on programs that helped to identify those type of performance enhancing drugs within athletes. And that, of course, fascinated me, having been an athlete when I was younger and just kind of watching professional athletes and how that whole professional sports has really taken the human body to almost the complete apex of what it can do. And sometimes that is chemically induced. And so I thought it would be a great topic to talk about. So CC, let's jump right in, kind of give me a little bit of your background in that part of research and part of science, and then we'll take it from there.
Perfect. So I guess probably about 10 or 15 years ago, my lab at UCSD was doing type 1 diabetes research, and we became interested in some gene therapy potential approaches, cell-based gene therapy approaches for looking at and potentially generating cells that could make insulin. And so this led us to a person who's been a good friend of mine for now 20 years, Ted Friedman, who was a real pioneer in gene therapy. He has been at UCSD for most of his career, has sat on numerous committees, and really just a pioneer in using viral vectors and gene therapy, primarily in, a number of diseases. And as we started to work together, my lab was adjacent to his, and we started to talk about using sequencing at that time to detect changes in athletes. He'd become involved with the World Anti-Doping Agency and an advisor to them. And so we kind of started to, I think, naively think that we could use these early microarrays for looking at DNA, and also then what my kind of specialty was protein expression changes in athletes to be able to detect how people were doping. And this was really early days in this, and we thought, it's just as simple to take an athlete and randomly look at a panel of genes and see what the expression level was of various genes, or in my case, look at various protein expression using quantitative methods and say, hey, here it is now. After they've taken, say, insulin like growth factor 1 or some banned substance, we should be able to see quantitative changes in this. And therefore, we can develop a test, and doping will be eliminated in this. And you know, it was it was a cool idea based on the technology at the time, and it still is a cool idea. But I think what we found in the past 15 years is that it's really a much more complicated landscape than this. And I think some of the things that we talked about previously that were, exciting to you were kind of some of these questions that have arisen in the sports community. And I think that's probably where we'll go with this. But again, I don't really know. But the true goal is to kind of begin to explore these finer lines of, you know, doping and genetics, and kind of how athletes, elite athletes differ from regular athletes, from just people walking around like me. And so, yeah, so we started in this, and for many years, I reviewed grants for the World Anti-Doping Agency. And it was just an absolute thrill to see exactly how the doping agency was focused on both very large problems like we were trying to address, of kind of changing around what was happening in, gene systems on an organismal scale, versus kind of very targeted things. And so I have a number of references that I'm keeping around here, that I kind of want to make sure that I don't screw anything up and tell you anything false. But I kind of went through and looked at a few of the grants that World Anti-Doping Agency has been funding, just to give you and your listeners a kind of idea of some of the things that are being funded and being looked at now. And so you'll kind of see within this, and I'm just going to name off a
Yeah,
few.
go ahead.
So really, studies of glucocorticoids after oral administration, evaluation of reporting levels and washout periods, a focused study on one particular performance enhancing drug and how it can be going. So, and then for another one is, is Tamarodol even a performance enhancing drug? So there's still questions being asked as to what is considered performance enhancing. And I think one of the things that you and I, have talked about, and I think want to explore is, if Tamrodol is a performance enhancing drug for a certain potential population within the community. So say you have weightlifters, and some of them are taking it but have no effect by it, but some of them may. How can you then begin to say what's really performance enhancing? There's, looking at DNA mixtures and detection in blood sports as a message for looking at transfusions. So how can you tell if some of these elite riders, cyclists, have been doping and, putting in blood, or, these are active questions that are going on. So I just thought I'd give you a quick idea of a couple of the things that, were out there.
Yeah.
So,
and and all those things, while you're talking, 10 more questions just popped up.
please.
Let's start let's start from the beginning. So the stereotypical image of the doping is the 70s, the Eastern Bloc European countries that were under Russian control. You
Right.
have these crazy strong women and men, and and they were taking some really basic sort of, human growth or animal whatever it was that it was very obvious. And is that kind of when it started, or like the Anti-Doping Commission? How long has that been around?
I think it has been around for at least 50 years.
Oh, it has. Okay.
Kind of, yeah. So but it correlates again with the 70s, but there have been doping efforts, efforts to stop doping really since sport began.
Yeah.
And, it's really one of these things that it's an organized set. And forgive me if I got when WADA actually started, but I think that it was very much of finally a group of people getting together and saying, all right, we have all of these various groups that are doing these things. Let's make it uniform,
Yeah.
so that every country can fall under the same umbrella, so that something that's banned in one is not banned in the other. And they've done a fantastic job of it.
Yeah. And just using the professional cycling as an example, and there's tons of them out there, but just using that one as an example, back in the day when Lance was just destroying the field, all of his issues. But I also remember sort of almost at the end of that whole thing, when it was finally about to come down that he was going to get busted for all this, it was one or two Tour de France's prior to that. Like it was common knowledge. Even the commentators were talking about guys getting blood transfusions after a ride, getting ready for the next stage. So it was definitely totally prevalent. And like you're just skirting the edges of what's legal and what's not legal at that point.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how this really, and this is really where WADA and USADA came into a lot of being and getting a lot of attention, was their efforts to ensure that that people like Armstrong, they knew that something was going on. It's then figuring out what it was, because, to be honest, a lot of these athletes have access to, companies. Think about Balco and some of these things that were happening in baseball. And they have access to really amazing technology, and really technology that made them much better than the average baseball player. And this is just something that needed to be addressed in the field. And so baseball and cycling really were kind of what took off in all of this.
Yeah. And in Lance Armstrong's case, and this is where it gets very fascinating. Obviously, his machine had enough money to hire the best chemists on their end and the best scientists on his side to fight against you guys and the anti-doping side. And so is it just purely that he had enough money to buy the best and just you guys were trying to keep up with it? Or I say you guys, I mean the anti-doping.
I think it was a little bit of a game of whack-a-mole at the time. And I don't think anybody would disagree that the people trying to regulate were always coming up against new unknowns. And I think that that's why and people can disagree with this, but I think that a lot of the move towards trying to understand genetic changes and changes in protein expression and changes in gene expression were really popularized because they realized that trying to find every new chemical that could enhance performance was going to be a formidable task. And finding out what the response was in the athlete was going to be much easier. And it turned out that it's equally difficult. But again, because you're laying on top of that the genetics. But again, we've gotten better at it. And one of the things that's, I think, important to note is that this isn't really in humans alone that we're seeing this. And really one of the most interesting things is looking for doping in horses.
Oh yeah. Yep.
And but they're able to they're able to do gene editing on horses, and all sorts of potential changes to the germline that can be heritable throughout generations. And so it gets a lot more complicated, when you talk about a human, you're normally thinking about, well, it's going to enhance either in the short term or do something of that nature. When you're talking about an animal like a horse, you can make mutations that affect the germline that then get passed down generations. And how can then you tell what is actually doping and what is a genetic variant? And so it gets incredibly complicated very quickly.
And that, yeah, and in horse riding or in horse racing, they actually have in the book whatever that chemical is that the horse is allowed to be on, whether it's on that
LASIK.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so is that considered a performance enhancing drug?
It's not necessarily it's for breathing, and so they like for people to know it because it can change how the horse behaves. And this gets in, and you talk to a bunch of people who are experts at horse racing, and horses perform differently under having LASIK versus not having LASIK, and if they're off it for a certain amount of time. So it does make a difference, but it's a known variable.
Yeah.
It's not like making a change to the ACTN3 gene that that increases. If you knock that gene down, you get higher ability for endurance. So there's a huge difference.
Yeah. And obviously there the scientists on that side that are trying to find these ways of cheating. I mean, like just what you just said, it just goes down to the subatomic level that if you change one thing, literally the endurance of the animal or the athlete changes.
Yeah. Well, so you said something so let's not always assume malicious intent with this.
Okay.
And so let me give you an example, okay? And this is a pretty good example. And you've probably seen it and heard about it, and that's myostatin, okay? And myostatin is so negatively regulates muscle growth. So if you type in myostatin inhibitor into your web browser, what you'll see is lots of pictures of really beefy cattle, beefy horses, these really hypermuscular horses and animals. Okay, there have been children, especially if there's a child in one of the Nordic countries who was born with a defective myostatin gene, and the kid at 7 years old was just nothing but muscle. His parents were elite athletes, and this is a natural this was just a natural crossing of the genes. So this kid is hypermuscular. And so what they found, and it's got this mutation in myostatin. And so what people have found is that if you block myostatin, and there's a number of drugs out there that you can do it. There's one called Myo-029. And what it does is it blocks this that allows for muscle growth. And this is being used for treatment of muscular dystrophy. So it's serving a good purpose, but people can co-opt it and make it and say, all right, look, if I want to gain 20% muscle mass, I could take this drug that's not designed for me. Yeah. So it's not always so cut and dry as to somebody having malicious intent. It's kind of a natural consequence of what the research actually is into the field.
And I guess you're right in the sense that everybody is, especially at those elite levels, they're doing everything they can, within the rules, and maybe sometimes just outside of it, but everything they can to get the best out of themselves to be at absolute peak performance. Yeah. So it just comes across as nefarious because of that. And I'm sure we're going to talk about this in a second, is that documentary that was made about the doping, that journalist who did the year's worth of doping with the Russians. It just comes across, and I hate to be picking on Lance because at the time I just thought he was awesome. And even after, and I must be honest here, even after he was caught having done all that, I just loved his attitude. I just loved how aggressive he was. And maybe that was partly because of the chemicals that he was using. But I think he was just a ultra competitive dude. I just loved his attitude, but obviously he took it too far.
But you know, we're kind of skirting around the issue of whether doping should be something that is just openly acknowledged. And, you know, this is an ethical debate. As, you know, there have been people through the years who've proposed having a an Olympics where people can be taking anything versus those who don't. And, you know, it's a question that bioethicists and other people should be having, but it's an interesting one to sit back and listen to. I guess where kind of my interests have always um, been, and I think that this probably goes to a lot of the heart of this, is looking at genetic variants within people. And, you know, I think we all have heard or read about the Malcolm Gladwell book of this 10,000 hours, sort of if you practice for 10,000 hours, you can become an expert in anything. And, you know, through the years, this has been largely debunked because, you know, I don't care if I play tennis for 100,000 hours. I'm never going to be as good as Serena Williams,
Right.
ever. Not even close. There's a genetic component to it. And this fall, you can't kind of have the doping discussion without the genetic component built in. Because if we go back to the myostatin example, you know, how do you classify somebody who has a genetic variant that is the same as if somebody started doping? You know, how do you put that? Is that fair to have that athlete compete? It's natural, but it's also what gives other people but if other people did it unnaturally, it would be considered an advantage.
Yeah.
So where do you put this into the field?
If I remember correctly, we even went so far as we were talking about prosthetics. You know, if somebody who's able to have a top of the line leg that actually improved their abilities, why wouldn't it be okay for a normal person to cut their leg off and get that same thing?
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that this
is a fascinating question.
Right. It's a great question. And, you know, it's one that we're going to have to start to face as we understand how different everyone is. You know, the example in the book, and the name escapes me, but I will get it to you for post-production, about baseball players. Most baseball players have a genetic polymorphism, which is just, you know, it's the same protein, it's just a single amino acid change, and no one understands how or why, but that allows them to see things moving a little bit faster. So they can see pitches better and anticipate better. And so it's training, but it's also genetics. And so I butchered that, I'm sure, but there are a number of examples. You know, there's a group of people. So they found over 200 different polymorphisms that are associated with exercise traits, and 20 different ones that are separate ones that are associated with elite athlete status. So there is, and this is across, you know, all sorts of athletes all over the world. So this genetic component of it is undeniable.
Yeah.
And, you know, but then there's also the idea of, you know, nature, and, you know, nature being the genetics and nurture being, you know, being able to have the time to practice, be able to, you know, have the family support, the coaches. So there's a lot of different things that go into making an athlete, and how we can contribute to helping make sure that what we're watching is fair within a range. We have to
Right.
figure this out. This is
Yeah.
this is debates that are coming down all over the place, through the NCAA as well as professional sports.
Yeah.
You know what is?
And
Yeah, go ahead.
no, no, I apologize for interrupting. Yeah, that and perfect example is the NFL. You know, the season will be going, and you'll hear about a guy who gets suspended for a couple of games because he took something that was off on the PED list or something like that. And those guys, uh, I would love to know what a supplement regimen that those guys are on to that brings it kind of right up to that line of being illegal or not allowed within the NFL.
Right. And I think that a lot of the settings of these are relatively arbitrary. It's, can you detect it? Um, so one of the more interesting studies here that kind of came out is, this was back in 2011 and 12. There was an Indian athlete named Duty Chand, who was a sprinter, and she had hyperandrogenoidism, which caused her body to naturally produce levels of testosterone that are in the range of what is typical for a male. And she was barred from international competition. And how do you go about taking, so,
Yeah,
on
yeah,
one hand you say, what, so where do you draw the line? And she fought and was eventually reinstated many years later. But this is this is something that, as we get better at testing, we aren't guesses necessarily getting better at understanding where things come from and being able to discriminate between something that is natural and unnatural in a way that makes sense for the athletes to fairly compete.
yeah. And it sounds like the research that you were doing, and I assume that is still being done, is to establish what a natural baseline would be, and then anything above that would maybe put up a red
Well,
flag.
so
And then
that's what we started with. That was the naive starting point, was, yeah, everybody should have about the same levels. But it turns out that's not true.
yeah, huh,
So, do you punish an elite athlete for, say, somebody has abnormally high levels of red blood cells, or say somebody has a mutation that makes them an able to run longer
yeah,
endurance?
yeah,
How do you, that's, you know 50 years ago, that would have just been, you know a freak of nature. But now we know what it is, and we know that not everybody has it. So do we cater to the lower end of it, or do we actually say, we understand why? Man, look at this person go and press the limits of what
yeah,
humans can do.
yeah. Well, and so to that point, what are some of the new developments, or are you aware of what's kind of going on with the current research and the current, experimentation that the anti-doping?
Yeah, so there's, like we kind of basically touched on here. Um, one of the more recent papers that popped out was, screening for gene doping transgenes in horses using massively parallel sequencing. So what they are doing is taking horses that, and that, drawing blood from them and looking for ways in which people might have injected things in them. So they spike in positive things that they can test for. And so, one of the things is, if you put in a adeno-associated virus with a cargo in it that is going to enhance gene production. So let's say you've got a panel of I don't know. Let's see here. This looked at 31, yeah, somewhere around 30 different um, types of genes and promoters. Basically, a promoter is something that allows transcriptional machinery to sit down on it and make the gene. And so, under normal circumstances, you have exons and introns of DNA, and you have promoters upstream. And so there's ways that you can look to see how genes are actually spliced and all of that together. This is oversimplifying it very much. But within the cargo load of an adeno-associated virus, you don't have room for all of that. So you
Gotcha.
actually have to put the whole gene together. And so you could actually sequence across these various regions and see whether they've been artificially created. And so, what this group was doing, and I should give credit where it's due, this is from Gillian Manjo and Ed Ryder, and they are from the UK at Cambridgeshire. And what they are trying to do is set up some sort of standard set of um, primers and basically conditions in which people can say, all right, you can search for any of these types of changes that may be in horses, run this panel, and then if any of them pop up, that means that at some point down the line, they have been genetically they have been modified with a transgene,
Artificially. Yeah.
artificial. And so this is really where a lot of the world is going, is looking for this as well as using CRISPR technology, which is this gene editing where you think of this Cas protein as a pair of molecular scissors. And you can go in and say, for instance, make a change that changes the myostatin gene from from being its normal effective to being maybe fivefold less effective, and that induces muscle growth. So you're looking at this both in animals, and you can begin to do this in humans. I mean, there are ongoing CRISPR trials now for humans to treat disease. Monogenic diseases tend to be what are the focus at this point, like sickle cell or beta thalassemia, but they're ongoing in humans.
And
And
if you don't mind me asking, what is that?
yeah,
What is that process like? Does somebody go into an operation? I mean, what? How does
um,
that happen in a human? Or how does it? How
it
does
would be
somebody, I guess, implement that or
so
administer that in a
these
human?
things are given up. So these things are you can build these viruses in the lab, and you can inject viruses. I mean, they're viruses. I know.
Amazing.
It's absolute. It's crazy, isn't it?
Okay, so just kind of using a personal example from back in college, when I
Mhm.
played lacrosse in college. I remember at the end of the semifinals one year, um, it was a random drug test. So I got grabbed basically out of the lineup. They came up to me and grabbed me. You know, I'm a freshman at this point, and so I go in and it's a urinalysis. So you go in, you got to take
Mhm.
you give them a urine sample, and the game was just finished. I was exhausted. I was probably completely dehydrated. I remember I was standing in the shower for like 20 minutes, just trying to get myself to go to the
Yeah.
bathroom. So that's a kitschy example of the random, and back then they were just looking for whether kids are smoking pot or other
Right.
drugs that kids do. What is that like? Do you know what that's like today? Like for instance, for an NFL team, do they randomly do that, and how does
Yeah.
that work?
So I can tell you that one of the real problems with trying to detect these genetic modifications is that these are often given intramuscularly as an injection. And so what has to happen is you have to get a bit of a muscle biopsy to really see well. It's not going to show up necessarily in saliva or tears or sweat or urine. So there's been a push to try to do non-invasive methods for all of this. Taking blood is something, I mean, if you're an endurance athlete, taking blood out is certainly not something that you want. So trying to figure out because you've got different times, different people, you can't coordinate all of that. It's going to be unfair at some point to somebody.
Right.
And you've got that. So people have been trying very hard to figure out how to be able to look at any sort of changes and test for this. Urine remains really still the top easy way of getting this. One of the things that we did as we were working with some people was we used buccal swabs. Just took a little Q-tip, swab the inside of the cheek, got a few cells. You could grow it, and you could extract genomic DNA out of that. So you could not just do genomic DNA, you could also get messenger RNA, which is kind of telling you what protein, what the expression level of various genes are. So there's a lot of different ways, and sequencing technologies have gotten so good here that it's getting much cheaper to do all of this. You can do, you could do a next generation sequencing experiment and multiplex lots and lots of different samples. And so this is kind of how people are doing things today. And it's not terribly expensive. But the idea, I guess one of the things that we should possibly consider is, what is an ideal drug test? I mean, it would be something that's, fast. It could be administered on the spot.
Yeah.
It's always accurate. And so trying to find out what that is, it's, and it's going to probably be different for a swimmer versus somebody who throws a shot put. And how do we actually begin to understand what are the right questions to ask? I'm a big fan of trying to figure out what's the right question to ask. The answer is always easy. The question is always hard. And this has been a really difficult thing. And I'm not real sure what the answer is, but I'm pretty sure that the technologies that we are developing are very much stopgaps for what needs to be done.
That's what I find so fascinating about, especially when you cut me off earlier in terms of, go easy on the nefarious aspect of this, because it comes across as that. It comes across as trying to do whatever you can to get that advantage over somebody. And I keep going back to the Lance Armstrong issue, because I remember when I was reading his book, It's Not About the Bike. If I remember correctly, the way his team was telling everybody, it's like, well, Lance just has a stronger heart muscle than normal humans. He can pump more blood into his muscles and therefore get more oxygen in his muscles. And was what he was doing chemically, was that altering that, or did he actually have a naturally stronger heart? And that goes back to your original point anyway.
And it's likely that it's both.
Yeah.
and that, that's where it starts to get incredibly complicated. I think we talked about golfers as well, and vision. And the really simple example of, if you're a golfer and you have 20/20 vision and are able to shoot your round, that's great. Let's say, though, you decide to get LASIK surgery and you've got 20/10 vision. So you've actually got better than average. You're overcorrected and can see better. What advantage, if any, does that give you? It likely might give you, it might, archery might be a better example. There's a ton of different things where vision, baseball players, any of these things, is corrective surgery considered to be a doping idea? And again, this is something that I think intelligent people can disagree on. And it's not necessarily that there's a wrong or right answer. It's more that we need to figure out where the line is and what's stepping over it. Because, I don't think either one of us would necessarily disagree that if you have a little bit better of an eyesight, at least I know with my golf game, it doesn't help me a damn bit. But then again, I'm not an elite athlete.
Yeah, I love it. And it's this conversation is inevitably going into the realm of what you were talking about earlier, and that's that idea of, where is the human being going? That bioethics that whole argument, and that's where it gets extremely interesting. And I remember just a couple of months ago, it was on PBS. It was a documentary about this famous rock climber who got caught in a storm, ended up getting caught out in the wilderness, almost died, ends up losing both his legs below his knees because of frostbite. And he still wanted to compete and still wanted to climb. So he made himself prosthetics. And then he realized, he's like, okay, I can do this. Then he goes and gets his PhD in biomechanics, now runs the biomechanics lab at MIT right now, building like the Terminator type second generation prosthetics. And it's fascinating because they open up the show with his TED talk. And he said something along the lines of, I'm not a cyborg yet, but I want to be. Like, and I can't wait to get there. And that's this whole bioethics thing. I mean, it's a fascinating.
Yeah. And, I think you're exactly right that we're going to have to deal with, and it will probably come in the Paralympic Games before it comes anywhere else. This mixture of human and machine.
Yeah.
And where does the humanity, what's considered human and what's considered robot versus, in a sport setting.
Yeah.
And, if you get an advantage, that's using your brain, and, it's a different set of ethical questions. And I believe that, any physically challenged person, and mentally challenged as well, should be able to compete in sport. That's a fundamental thing that makes us all, competition is healthy for everyone. It's making sure that, is somebody who has this set of enhanced bionic type legs going to be able to climb, faster? If that's the case, does it make sense to compare apples to apples? And I think, to kind of extend this metaphor a little bit, that what we're finding within human populations is that it's all apples. But you've got your Granny Smiths, you've got your delicious reds, but they're apples. And what then constitutes an orange? And what are those limits? And I know that there are much more intelligent people than me out there who are trying to address exactly those points. But, when you boil it down, a lot of this comes down to the passion of the human for being able to do things that we never thought possible.
Yeah.
And that's pretty freaking cool.
Yeah. Well, and that's, we're right on the cusp. We're right on the cusp of that in humanity, to taking it to that next level of what is it? Are we still human doing this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, look at what many athletes wear for protection of their knees and their legs that are preventative. We haven't really gotten into the preventative side. If you've had an ACL tear, and you have a brace that allows you to still compete by stabilizing the muscles, is that really giving you an advantage? I mean, it's not necessarily an advantage, but it's something that other people don't have, because you're protecting an asset during healing, or protecting it from actually falling apart.
Yeah.
How does that fit into all of this? I think that it's something that, again, should be allowed, but I don't know whether it confers any sort of advantage, or allow, or whether it's simply an extension, being able to extend the player's life. But it's a small step from having a brace to having a brace that actually helps, that enhances stabilization.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's probably coming.
Yeah. As and I'm just kind of thinking to myself, why do I love watching professional football as an example?
Mhm.
Because essentially you're looking at the human being at the highest level of athleticism. And, so you got those guys out there, the top of the top. There's probably, call it 100 of those guys that are just the the apex of human athleticism. But then why are there 3 or 4 that are above all of them? And to me, I guess that would be the thing now that I really appreciate is that's those innate things about an individual that makes them just that much better, even from the best.
Exactly. And isn't that just, I mean, there is nothing like watching a Tom Brady type person play.
Yeah.
I mean, these athletes are amazing. And you watch some of these kids from high school into college and you see how fantastic they are. And when they hit the pros, they become part of this ultra elite group. But then there's some that just rise further, and it's just absolutely the best thing to watch. It's fantastic. It's why I love sports so much.
Yeah, no, and I agree. And that's what I often kind of going back to Lance, and sorry, Lance, I apologize about picking on you here, but going back to him, I wondered if everybody, let's just say Lance was taking X, and if all the rest of the field was able to take X as well, would he still have dominated? And my personal feeling is, based on what I think I know of the type of character he is, he probably would have been still up at the top, even with all of that.
Well, that's where I think that, you have, that's why you can't just, and I agree completely, but you can't just say it's a genetic thing or it's a doping thing. It's also the nurture side of the athletes. How many hours you practice, how dedicated you are. To the best football players are the ones who understand the game from every aspect of it. It's the same with soccer. It's the same with basketball. The real students of the sport, the ones who take it in at every level, are truly the ones who I think excel. And that's that nurture side. It's that love of it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I completely agree. Completely agree. One last thing, and then I'll let you go here. What are you still involved in this sort of thing, or have you kind of stopped doing this?
I've stopped doing this because as I've gone to work at a large multinational drug company, my ability to spend time doing these kind of other endeavors has minimized. However,
Gotcha.
at some point, I still know a couple of the people over there. And I think that it's probably a pretty good connection to make, and would like to get back involved because, there's also benefits for human disease in understanding some of this stuff. And so, but that's kind of that's one of my interest, and not necessarily the interest of my corporation.
Right.
But I certainly think that understanding this and staying up on the field and really following how these debates are going will help inform us with medicine. I mean, to go back and end with kind of one of the things that we started with, thinking about muscular dystrophies. If the doping community is building muscle by inhibiting myostatin, we can watch how this works, and we can see and learn lessons from this. It might not be the best controlled experiments, but there are lessons to be gleaned from this.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, Cece, this is fascinating. I could go on forever. I love talking about this sort of thing because you always force me to think outside of my little bubble. So thank you very much.
And you do the same for me. That's why I think we're friends.
Well, no, I definitely appreciate your time. And let me finish off by saying, if you're in the military, the police departments or the fire departments, first responders, if that's you out there, thank you very much for your service. Stay safe. CC King, as usual, it's a pleasure, sir.
Thank you, sir. Have a good one.
This is the Rain Man. Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching Rain Man's Take, observations on the world we live in. If you like the content, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. You can also follow Rain Man's Take on Instagram at Rain Man's Take. Also, check out our website at www.rainmanstakepodcast.com and send your comments to rainmanstake@gmail.com. Keep an eye out for future podcasts, which will be coming out every Thursday at 5 p.m. West Coast time.